Welcome, everyone. This talk is sponsored by the Yale Center for Environmental Communication at the Yale School of the Environment. Based at Yale University School of the Environment, the Center for Environmental Communication, or YCEC for short, focuses on four areas. We conduct research on the psychological, cultural, and political factors that influence environmental attitudes and behavior. We teach students and train working professionals. We convene a global network of climate communication scholars and practitioners. And we inform and engage the public through environmental journalism, including our Yale Climate Connections, a climate-focused news service that engages many thousands of people every day and includes a short daily radio story that airs on nearly 800 stations nationwide. From the government shutdown to tariffs, immigration, AI, the cost of living, and a host of other pressing issues, how are Americans thinking about climate change and clean energy, and how do we talk about them in today's environment? Our speakers today will help us understand whether people view climate action and the cost of living as competing goals and what that means for effective messaging. If you are an organization looking for support in your communications related to climate or clean energy, please reach out to our partnerships team at ypccc.partners@yale.edu, and I'll include that in the follow-up email, so no worries if you didn't catch that email address. As for the logistics, the chat is closed. Please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to ask questions and to vote for your favorite questions that others have asked. We will make a recording of this conversation available on our website and send a link to everyone who registered. Our two speakers today will be Dr. Anthony Leiserowitz, the director of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, and Will Howard, head of Insights and Advisory Services at Potential Energy Coalition. Dr. Leiserowitz is an internationally recognized expert on public climate change beliefs, attitudes, policy support, and behavior, and the psychological, cultural, and political factors that shape them, and conducts research globally, including in the United States, China, India, and Brazil. The Potential Energy Coalition brings together people with backgrounds in marketing, data, creative, and campaigns to shift the narrative on climate change. Before joining Potential Energy, Will Howard led messaging research at Miss Lansky and Partners, the world's premier language strategy firm. He worked across sectors from snacking to scrap metal and pharma to farming. He helped clients find the right words to frame public debates, sell products, and communicate their ideas in a polarized political environment. Dr. Leiserowitz?
Thank you, Eric, and thank you all for joining us at such an important moment in our larger community and politics. So today, Will and I are going to share some recommendations from research that each of our organizations have conducted over the past few months over how to communicate climate change and clean energy during the current cost of living crisis. But note that we've just had a real-world test of these messages in the elections that were held just a couple days ago. So as quick context, it's important to remember that nationwide, electricity rates have increased more than 5% in just the past year. So this is absolutely hitting people at the kitchen table in their monthly bills. And the exit polls from the election just 2 days ago found that cost of living, including electricity costs, was at the very top of voters' minds in New York City, in New Jersey, Virginia, and in Georgia. And importantly, candidates in all of these races ran on platforms supporting the transition to clean, affordable energy, and they all won. None of them ran away from clean energy. None of them were silent about clean energy. They all ran on clean energy, and they all won. And in fact, the election in Georgia was, of course, the most direct test of clean energy messaging. So in Georgia, the Georgia Public Service Commission regulates utilities in the state. And Republicans have held all 5 seats for literally decades. So 2 seats were on the ballot on Tuesday, and Democrats won both of those races with nearly 63% of the vote. Okay, a huge margin. And they were the first Democrats to win statewide elections in Georgia since 2006, so almost 20 years ago. And both candidates explicitly campaigned on clean energy. One candidate, Peter Hubbard, said, "We need to make the transition to clean energy, which will help to lower utility bills and help to clean up the air, land, and water, and importantly, public health." Likewise, Alicia Johnson backed clean, cost-effective solutions, including rooftop and community solar, wind, battery storage, and microgrids. And they did not do this in a vacuum. Their opponents were arguing that Democrats were going to close gas plants and drive up power bills with environmental mandates. But those arguments didn't work. And this was in Georgia, which is not exactly a blue state like, say, New Jersey. So with those recent election results in mind, here's what we found at least a few months ago, which I think were largely validated by the election. So let me share my screen. And can I get a yay from Eric that you can see this? Or
Slides.
Will? Yes. Okay, great. All right. So as many of you know, I direct the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. We do 2 nationally representative surveys every year with our colleagues down at George Mason University. So every spring, every fall, and have been doing so for almost 20 years. Just FYI, we're literally going into the field today. And so we're going to have some very new results probably within the next month on exactly how Americans are responding now that the election has passed us. And now we're looking forward to what happens next year. But here's where Americans were just a few months ago in May. So here I'm showing you the results of a study we did on what were Americans most worried about. So we started off with doing qualitative research where they told us, just open-ended wise, what they were most worried about. We then converted those into survey questions, and here's the results for all Americans. And as of May, the number one issue that people were most worried about was government corruption, followed, of course, by the cost of living, then the economy, the state of democracy, the disruption of federal government services, which almost certainly would now be higher in this list because of the government shutdown that's currently going on. And global warming was mid-tier. Okay, so not super high, not super low, but right there about in the middle. So about, what is that? 65% of Americans were at least somewhat worried about global warming, which is very consistent with our research all along. But let's break this down. So as many of you know, we for years have been studying what we call global warming 6 Americas, 6 different publics within the public that each respond to this issue in very different ways. So for those who don't remember, the alarmed is 26% of the country as of last, just about a year ago. That's over a quarter of the country who are firmly convinced it's happening, it's human caused, it's serious, it's urgent, they strongly support action, they want to get personally involved. But the big question in their mind is, what do we do? Okay, so in other words, as a community, we've done a really good job helping them understand why this is such an important issue, but we have not done an adequate job of helping them understand what the solutions are. And they really are hungry to know what those solutions are. Then comes a group we call the concerned, also think it's happening, human caused and serious, but still tend to think of the impacts as distant in time, as in not, we won't see impacts for a generation or more, or in space. This is about polar bears or developing countries, but not us, not my community, my friends, my family, not me. So here they still need to better understand that climate change is happening right here, right now, and already harming the people, places, and things that we love. The cautious, still on the fence. Is it real? Is it not? Is it human? Is it natural? Paying attention, but still kind of confused. The disengaged, a small proportion of Americans who basically say, I don't think I've even heard of global warming before. I don't see about it in the media I pay attention to. No one I know talks about it. So there's literally, they're still struggling with basic awareness. Then comes a group we call the doubtful, who say, I don't think it's real, but if it is, it's natural, just natural cycles, nothing we had anything to do with, nothing we can do anything about. So they don't see it as a risk. And then last but not least are the dismissive, who are firmly convinced it's not happening, it's not human caused, it's not a serious problem, and who quite literally tell us that they're conspiracy theorists. They say it's a hoax, it's scientists making up data, it's a UN plot to take away our sovereignty, and many other such conspiracy narratives. And the important thing to note here is that they're 10%. They're only 10%, but they are a really loud and vocal 10%, and they are very well represented in Washington, D.C. these days. Okay, so with that framework in mind, let's look at how top worries play out across these different audiences. And let's start right here with the alarmed and concerned, the alarmed and the concerned. And the alarmed, again, over a quarter of the country actually has global warming as the number one thing that they're most worried about, which makes sense. That's what defines them, is that they are worried about global warming. But they sure enough do care about this. So already you can see that there is a constituency out there, a bunch of, frankly, really critical voters who you absolutely should be talking about climate change. If you're not talking about climate change, they're going to be less interested and less supportive because they are absolutely hungry to know, what do we do? Then comes government services, state of democracy, corruption, the economy, cost of living, mid-tier actually issue for that particular segment. By contrast, the concerned, cost of living in the economy right at the top of their worries, global warming lower overall, but note that most of them are at least somewhat worried. Okay, so again, very consistent with their inclusion in this particular category. But clearly, cost of living much higher on their worry list. Then we turn to these middle two groups, the cautious and the disengaged. Again, government corruption, cost of living right at the top of their worries. Global warming relatively low, but kind of divided here. Somewhat worried, not very worried is really where the cautious are, which makes sense. Disengaged, cost of living absolutely is the top of their worry list. And then for these last two groups, the doubtful and dismissive, this is where it's also fascinating because, of course, cost of living was high among their list of worries, but substantially lower than their true number one worry, which was immigration. Too many immigrants living in the U.S. illegally, followed by government corruption over here, crime over here, corruption there. Cost of living substantially lower in terms of their top worries. Global warming, unsurprisingly, it's almost by definition, the dismissive find that something that they don't worry about at all. Okay, so you can already see that there's actually diverse sets of answers to what are people's top issues, depending on who they are and where they're coming from. The other thing, and we're mostly going to be talking about energy, clean energy and electricity as a kitchen table issue, cost of living issue, but it's also important to recognize that there are multiple things happening all at the same time that are affecting people's kitchen table and monthly bills. And one of those is the cost of homeowners insurance. And so I'm just going to say a few things here, even though we're going to mostly talk about electricity. And that is that we find that nationally, 2/3 of Americans say that homeowners insurance rates are increasing a lot, while another 16% say they're increasing a little. Almost no one says that these rates are decreasing. Okay, so people have noticed that insurance rates are going up. And when we ask why are these rates going up, they overwhelmingly say that it's inflation, it's insurance companies increasing their profits, it's these disasters that we're all seeing more frequent and more severe of hurricanes and floods and wildfires, increased property values they think are also playing a role. But you've also got about 58% of Americans who think that global warming is playing at least a role. So it's just to say that this is a set of facts that many Americans are at least open to, but it does say that there's enormous potential here to talk more, to help people connect the dots between climate change, these extreme weather events, and how that's showing up in insurance, not just insurance rates, but even your ability to get insurance as insurers increasingly are fleeing at-risk areas. So I think there's enormous potential here, but we'll talk a little bit about that, but let's just say that's a subject for a lot more research and maybe a future webinar. And when we ask how much do you think global warming is affecting the increase of the cost of insuring a home in the United States, when we break that down by political party and ideology, you see that liberal Democrats are already strongly believe that climate change is having an impact on insuring a home, followed by moderate and conservative Democrats. Overall, again, 58% of Americans as a whole, and then fewer liberal moderate Republicans or conservative Republicans. But very interestingly, you still have a sizable number of conservative Republicans who are at least thinking that climate change might be playing a partial role in this. So again, just illustrating that I think there's enormous potential here in this particular contribution to the cost of living crisis that people are very much experiencing. Okay, so with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Will Howard at Potential Energy, who will share their research insights. Take it away, Will.
Thanks so much, Tony. Appreciate the introduction and the very helpful context. Really excited to be sharing this work. It feels very timely, although it's something we've actually been working on for a few months now. So really looking forward to the opportunity to be able to share it with you all now. So I will say just one quick important note about our organization, Potential Energy. We are a C3 organization, so please bear that in mind as you think about the data that I'm about to walk you through. And if you have any appetite to use this data, please do reach out to us and check with us to make sure it's all safe and fair use. But with that said, let me just tell you a little bit about what that data is and where it comes from. So we've done a number of surveys at this point. Affordability is something we've been thinking about paying attention to for a while, stretching back to early last year, when in April we did a pretty large national survey. Subsequently, we've done some state-specific surveys. Most notably, we did a large one in Virginia earlier this year in the summer. And then the bulk of the data that I'm going to be showing you today comes from a very recent survey that we did, kind of hot off the presses, ending late in August, of 14,000 folks in the US. We have a wave that we're doing in the UK and in Canada as well that we will be looking to integrate in the future, but the data that I'm sharing today is all US specific. We've supplemented this along the journey with a couple of different focus groups as well. We talked to around 100 people in the last year or so, including most recently a wave in the spring where we talked to a series of focus groups really looking at homeowners and to a lesser extent, small business owners, people who are what a utility would call a ratepayer, what the rest of us would call a customer or someone who pays electric bills. So people who are experiencing the cost of living crisis in different ways. And you'll see quotes from those participants in some occasions as we go through here. They've also contributed to the way we've been thinking about the issue. So I'll just start with something that I think in principle needs no introduction and should go without saying, but I do think it's helpful to put a couple numbers against it. The first is just that straight up, if you put the statement in front of people in America today, are we living in a cost of living crisis? Those words, cost of living crisis. 76% of America is going to agree with you, and almost 50% of them are going to strongly agree with you, which is a really large number. And that's basically shared regardless of almost identically across race, gender, class. There is a slight gap on political ideology, which is interesting to note that conservatives, Republicans are 10 to 15 percentage points less likely to actually agree with this, although that still means it's a strong majority that's agreeing. It is interesting that in some ways this question is a little bit of a proxy for kind of a right track, wrong direction, confidence in the way the country is going in that sense. But largely speaking, it is very consistent regardless of how you cut the data. What that actually means, though, like cost of living crisis is a pretty strong phrase. And so we tried to unpack a little bit what that actually means for people. And we looked at it through a couple different lenses. You can find data like this and from other sources as well if you want to go deeper on exactly where people are feeling the pain. But a couple points that we felt were really relevant to caveat or to at least frame up what people mean when they say that they think it's a cost of living crisis. The first is that basically 60% of America says that they feel like they have little to nothing left over from paycheck to paycheck. There's about 13% combined that say they are actively unable to provide for themselves right now. And there's about 27% who says that they're living comfortable. For the most part, the largest chunk of America is saying that they're either barely making it paycheck to paycheck or making it paycheck to paycheck with, quote, a little bit left over. And so when they say they're in a cost of living crisis, it's a little bit less about actively being unable to meet needs in this moment. And it's a little bit more about what I would call wants and what ifs. There is a feeling of cutting back. 63% of America feels like they're having to trim back on things that they want to be spending money on that they can't. And then there's also around a 30-40% chunk of the population, not on this slide, who says they would not be able to weather a financial emergency and would be ruined by they're one emergency away from financial disaster. And that kind of feeling of being on the edge, that feeling of frustration, fear, tightening, what if, what's around the corner, that's a really big emotional undercurrent to what we mean by a cost of living crisis. And then, really importantly, most of the country says that they're in no better position than they were last year. Around a third of the population says they're actively worse. Around a third says that they're in the same condition, and only about a third says that they're better off than they were a year ago. So people are feeling like they're on the edge. They feel like we're maybe headed in the wrong direction. At the very least, things aren't getting better. They're feeling frustrated. They're feeling the pressure, and they're feeling stuck because the situation doesn't seem to be improving. As we get a little bit more under the hood, we look at the role that electric bills play in this feeling. We see that groceries, electricity, and housing in our test were rated as the top three sources of, quote, stress month to month. This is higher than something like education. It's higher than something like healthcare. Depending on how you ask the question, you can get slightly different answers. But what you tend to see is that the things that are at the top of the list are not the really big ticket items. They're the monthly painful, also crucially somewhat inevitable bills. The bill that you pay every month, the bill that you can't really get out of, the bill that to a certain extent, and particularly in case of electricity, as we heard from consumers when we talked to them in focus groups, you don't feel like you have a great deal of agency over them. When the price goes up, you can't not buy food, you can't not pay the electric bill. And even if you can try to tweak around the edges to change your habit, the fact that it's in most cases not a choice-driven market makes it that much more of a bitter pill to swallow when price does go up. Also, we then specifically asked, do you think your bills are going up? And obviously, there's economic data that, like Tony was already citing, that you would suggest that for most Americans, bills have gone up, and they certainly seem aware of it. So within the 70 or so percent of the sample who at least said their bills were a minor source of stress, so that's even broader than the chart on the left, which is just major and moderate stress, or at around half the population, 75% of would say it's at least a minor stress. Over 80% of those people who are feeling at least some stress from their electric bill, say their bills are higher than they were this time last year. So they're very much perceiving and feeling the trend that Tony was alluding to. Where it starts to get interesting, not that all of my data hopefully isn't interesting to you already, but where it really starts to get interesting is when you go a click deeper and you start thinking about asking people why they think this is the case. So we did this in two different ways. The first way, and I think the most interesting way for us, was to ask open-ended, so absolutely no prompting, no aiding, no reference has been made at this point in the survey to clean, to climate, to any particular politician or leader or entity. We had simply asked how people were doing financially, whether they thought their electric bills were going up or down. And then we asked them in your own words, who do you most directly blame for the increase in your electric bills? And people were able to write in whatever they wanted. And we used an AI crawler to comb through all of the answers that people gave us. And what we saw was that the vast majority were saying something, or sorry, about a third were saying electrics or electricity or utility companies. There's a chunk where if you lump together policy and politicians with maybe economy and inflation, maybe energy and infrastructure, where you get kind of another third or so that's a tranche that are in some way blaming political or economic forces. And then you have things like weather factors, personal usage, that are a little bit more of a third tier there. Only 2 to 3% of the answers in referenced explicitly in some way clean, climate, green, wind, solar. We were pretty broad in how we cast the net. This isn't to say that only 2% of people think that there's any cost associated with clean energy. That's not what I'm trying to claim based on this data. But what I am trying to level set on is the first order thing that people are blaming for this rise is much more likely to be corporate greed in some way, open-ended, or political agendas or policy makers. We asked a separate version of this question, which I don't actually have on a slide, where we gave people a much more of a forced choice. And actually, we said specifically politicians and their putting their political agendas ahead of everyday people, corporate greed, including utilities, putting profits ahead of people, and then sort of circumstantial or other factors that are outside the control of those people, things like geopolitics, disease, weather, things that people don't have any control over. Only around 10 or 13% or so of people went with the other option. Over half went with the politicians and their agendas, and then around the remaining 25% or so said that it was corporations. So open-ended, the first thing people say is probably something related to their utility or their electric company, or maybe something related to corporations and corporate greed. If you actually put a forced choice in front of them and you give them an option that talks about a political agenda, that's the place that they're going to go. But in both cases, it's much more about entities and their agendas and much less about any sort of specific thing tied to clean and green technology. We went further than that, though, because we actually did want to understand how people are thinking about the role of clean energy in a cost of living crisis and whether they think of it as expensive, affordable, part of the solution, part of the problem. So the conventional wisdom, and I think the way people talk about it today, is that there is a perception of a green premium and the idea that clean is more expensive in some way. Based on our data, and there's a lot of different ways you can ask this question, but the way that we went with is simply overall, which do you think is cheaper, clean energy like solar and wind, And I saw some comments in the chat about whether or not we included nuclear. We did not include nuclear for this study. Generally speaking, in the past, we've seen nuclear is viewed as a little bit more expensive, actually meaningfully more expensive in terms of the perception compared to solar and wind. So clean energy like solar and wind, or energy from fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. And what you see here is basically a third, a third, a third split of the population, where a third or so is saying that clean is cheaper, a third is saying they cost the same or I'm not sure, and a third or so is saying that fossil is cheaper. The reason I say a third, a third, a third is that if you look at this by political ideology, there's actually a bit of asymmetry where Democrats are a bit more likely, they're kind of bumping up the clean is cheaper number, whereas Republicans and moderates are much more on the kind of one third, one third, one third train. But if push came to shove, right now in America, this question asked this way, you get more people saying clean is cheap than people saying fossil is cheap. We also broadened it out a little bit and we asked people whether they thought these different sources of energy were going to get more or less expensive over the next 10 years. And around two-thirds of the people we spoke to, which included almost two-thirds of Republicans and conservatives, natural gas and gasoline were expected to get more expensive, where solar and wind were expected to stay the same or much more likely to be expected, much more likely to stay the same or even get cheaper. Again, I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not an economist. I'm not telling you that this is how these markets will behave by any mean. The economic reality is probably much more complicated, certainly much more complicated. But in terms of people's perceptions and people's expectations, the expectation is that the cost advantages solar, wind, clean energy have are, if anything, going to get larger in coming years. It therefore follows and is not entirely surprising based on that set of data that consumers expect that banning clean energy would actually hurt cost, whereas building clean energy, especially solar, could potentially help it. So how unfavorable or favorable would you say you are personally to the idea of banning clean energy in the United States? We were able to pull in a quote from politicians recently around the desire to ban, quote unquote, clean energy. And we asked people if they were opposed or in favor. And you see basically 3-1 opposed over in favor. That number actually looks pretty similar even when you get to Republicans. I think it was like 2-1 for a Republican or conservative split. So it's majority opposed. And the impact overwhelmingly of banning clean energy would be expected to be increasing my bills. So that's like a 4-1, 5-1 number where you have people saying that they actually think if you ban clean energy, it's going to negatively impact my bills. Conversely, if you ask people which of the following energy policies do you think would lead to the greatest savings on your own household energy bills, making it easier to build new solar energy in more places or making it easier for oil and gas companies to do drilling in more places, you actually see almost 2-1 people think that the more solar is going to do more for their bill than the more oil and gas. All of that leads us to really adopt the position that I think the way this has been talked about for a while now is that affordability and the cost of living crisis is a really serious problem or obstacle for clean energy conversations, for clean energy messaging. And based on the data and based on some more data that I'm about to show you, we feel really comfortable saying that it doesn't have to be. There are ways to think about this as an opportunity rather than an obstacle and to position clean energy as a solution for cost of living rather than kind of taking it as a given that we have to be worried that clean energy necessitates some sort of a trade-off. 3 ways to really make sure that we do that from a messaging perspective across the work we did. These are sort of the 3 rules of thumb I would leave you with about how to most effectively communicate about clean energy in a way that is going to nicely line up and be effective in this moment where people are so clearly worried about cost of living. And is first, be willing to talk about it. We saw in the data that people are actually quite elastic on this. I showed you that number about the roughly a third, a third, a third split of people who think clean energy is cheaper versus people who think clean energy fossil fuels are cheaper. We were able to almost double the number of people who were saying clean energy as a category was cheaper by showing them the right message. But they have to see the message. There is an extent to which people are operating on gut instinct right now. It's a low information environment to some extent around the actual costs of these energy sources. If we can get that information in front of them, we can meaningfully shape the way that they think about the category and the way that they think about the brand of clean energy. And in many ways, what I want to leave you all with today is to think of this as a brand challenge and a brand opportunity. How can we use really consistent messages that that own certain attributes and drive home certain perceptions of clean energy as a brand category, so that all of our conversations in this area get easier over time. So the second thing is not only show up, but second, reframe the choice. We see really clearly in testing that fossil fuel benefits from a status quo bias. There is an assumption that there are sort of two options on the table, which is be clean or don't be clean, go clean or don't go clean. Not doing a thing almost always feels cheaper than doing a thing. So it feels like a there's a bias to pick the do nothing option. The reality is, with demand being the way that it is and the world being in the place that it is right now, there is no do nothing option. All the actions that we could take on the table in front of us are active options. We can double down on dirty, we can build more fossil fuel, or we can start building more clean energy sources because we need more power. And when you frame it as an active choice, it's a much more fair fight than when you're fighting against status quo bias. And then lastly, there are three attributes that we really want to try to own as much as possible because they are all true. They are all true attributes of clean energy. And second, they are all very closely associated with affordability. An energy source that is unlimited, that is local, that is proven, is expected to be an energy source that is more affordable. And so if we can build brand associations with those attributes for clean energy, it'll do wonders for the way people feel about clean energy and costs going forward. So to the first point, when we show up, when we talk about affordability, we move people massively. This is the percentage of people before in the control cell on the left. So our baseline, 38% of people said clean was cheaper than fossil fuel, which I showed you already on a slide, right? In a separate cell, we showed them a message. We tried a bunch of different messages, but we showed the best message we showed people was able to, so we showed them a message before we asked them the same question. So 38% is no exposure whatsoever, no message, no influence. We just ask them, is clean cheaper or is fossil cheaper? The message on the right, we showed people a message first, then we asked them that same question. And the perception was around 27 points higher that clean was cheaper. So that's a pretty significant increase, suffice to say, not quite double, but very meaningful in terms of our ability to shape that perception of the category. And I'll show you what the message was in a second. But the point is, regardless of what the message is, there is ability to educate, to move, to shape the perception of the clean energy brand in this space. The second thing is a little bit of what I said. We have to take the do nothing option off the table. The question we are debating is not, should we invest in clean energy or not? Should we quote unquote go clean or not? Should we transition or not? The question is, we have to invest in something. We have to build something. We need energy. If we need energy, why would we not invest in the option that is cheap and getting cheaper, that is unlimited, that is local, that is proven? And when it's that trade-off, an active choice rather than a choice between doing nothing, it's a much better chance that the conversation is going to go positively. Lastly, we asked a max diff question. So this is an exercise, max diff being the technical term for it, but it was a question where basically we had a list of 8 attributes that could be associated with an energy source. Very importantly, we did not say any energy sources at all in this exercise. We simply asked an energy source that is blank, that has X attribute. People were shown short lists of these attributes in randomized combinations. They were asked to pick the one that they thought was most affordable and least affordable from the list. And over many, many iterations across a 1,000-person cell, you end up with basically every possible permutation has been shown again and again to people. And you get a score or a prediction for which of these attributes is most likely to be ranked as most affordable in a list of any 4 of them, right? So said more simply, even which of these attributes are most effectively or most strongly associated with the idea of affordability, agnostic of any actual specific energy source being named. The 3 that won, the 3 that are most strongly associated in this list are available locally, possessing of an unlimited supply, and based on long-established technology. Unlimited supply, I think, is one that we are familiar with and that we've talked about in the past in the clean energy space. Renewability itself is a nod to that. But the fact that available locally and local long-established technology are on par with it or even slightly stronger, more strongly associated than it is really interesting. Available locally, not something we necessarily always talk about. This featured really prominently in the messaging in Virginia, actually. around clean energy was very much tied to the idea of local. I don't even think they called it clean energy. They talked about it as local energy, which is really interesting to see. And then long established technology, that one in particular, I think runs counter somewhat to the prevailing instinct, which is to try to make it feel like new technology and be excited about innovation and novelty. And we see in our testing that that's actually least associated with affordability, or one of the least associated with affordability attributes. It's much better to focus on reminding people how long this stuff has been around. We've been trying to make solar panels work for 50 years. The prices have come down a ton since the early 2000s. So this is the place that we landed, which kind of brings the threads together. If you're really going to try to drive home the perception that clean is cheap, which is entirely possible to do, and in many cases you actually have more momentum on your side than you maybe realize. The place to start is with clean energy is cheap energy. Demand is up, bills are up. There's no do nothing option. This country needs more energy, and clean sources are simply the most affordable way to get it. Why is it so cheap? Well, fossil fuels run out, clean energy is infinite. It's unlimited. Fossil fuels are far away, clean is everywhere. That's local. Fossil fuels are getting more expensive, clean is 80% cheaper than in 2003. That's proven, right? Altogether, we need affordable power. Let's tap into the cheapest energy sources we have to bring bills down for everyday people. And that can get you 26 to 27 points of lift, really, regardless of political or ideological identity, in the perception that clean is cheaper than fossil. So I will stop there. I see there have been some chat questions accumulating. So I will bring Tony back in.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Will. Great insights there. Okay, so I'm going to lead with a question that we got here, and it's saying, do we have any insight regarding the perception of the cost of climate inaction? So, for instance, investing in resilience now to reduce the risk of expensive disaster later.
Yeah, we've looked at it through two lenses. You've alluded to insurance as one of them. We actually are really excited about insurance as a space for messaging. We've done a little bit of research and we see that there is a correlation in terms of support for climate action and living in a place that is at insurance risk right now. And we've also seen that messages that focus on the mounting insurance risk as a result of climate change are actually some of the more effective messages in our whole database in terms of driving people's support for action. We've also seen, particularly we've been looking at this year with some of the really tragic disasters, that preparation messages and the importance of preparation can be really powerful as well. We did a test last year that was kind of looking at the moral hazard question of, when you talk about preparation, are you distracting from the topic of emissions reduction? And in our tests, we saw, and there's more work to be done here, but it was heartening for us in terms of considering new strategies. We saw that a message entirely focused on the need to prepare more and the lives and money you can save by preparing was just as effective at increasing support for emissions reduction as an emissions reduction message was. Almost by focusing on the problem and the need to prepare for the problem, you treat it as a given and you get people invested in the broader goal of reducing emissions as well.
Yeah. And I'll add to that is that, first of all, the impacts themselves are exactly one of the core things that we need to help people better understand. I alluded to it before that many Americans still think of climate change as distant in time and in space. And yet in reality, everyone has been touched by climate change already. It's already impacting, where we live, the people and the places and the things that we care about. So helping people understand that these impacts are right here, right now, and we're already being harmed is already a way to shift their view of the issue of climate change as a whole and their support for action as a whole. That is the field that we call risk perception, and it's still the single strongest predictor of whether people take this issue seriously or not. So, and when you make those kinds of impacts concrete, and you begin to say, here's what not just the cost in human lives are, but the cost in property values and insurance rates and all these other things that are now literally showing up at the kitchen table on a monthly basis. This all again help people understand that, again, climate change is not distant in time and space. It's already hurting us now, and it's getting worse. And so it just changes the terms of the discussion from some sort of abstract to very real and very concrete. The other that I'll just, I think is important to underscore what Will just said there, and we've seen that in some of our work as well, is that having the conversation about vulnerability at the local level first is often a more productive way to get people to care about climate change and to want to mitigate climate change than to parachute into these communities talking about global climate change and often using alien terms like 1.5 and net zero and all this language that means nothing to them, and saying, hey, everybody, we got a global problem. When most people are born local, they live local, they're going to die local. Like, that's what their world is. That's what they care about. And instead, we've often said, no, we want you to come up to the global level and then think about the local, as opposed to starting local and then laddering your way up to the global. And in terms of the fundamental principle of communication, meet people where they are, like literally where they are, which is where they live. When you engage people there in this conversation, here are the impacts we're already experiencing. Here's how we're already being harmed. People want to then know, how can we prepare ourselves? How can we become more resilient as a community, et cetera? But as they engage that conversation, they very quickly realize that there's no way we're going to be able to simply adapt our way out of this problem, especially once they understand that things are only going to get worse. Okay, we've only warmed 1.2 degrees so far in centigrade. We're definitely going past 1.5. And we don't know how much more it's going to go than that. So we need to be having this conversation first and foremost. But secondly, once they realize what's happening, then they get very, very interested in mitigation, because they realize there's just no way we're going to be able to just simply build higher seawalls, for example, and that will solve the problem. So anyway, I think there's a tremendous amount there. There's a lot more research to come in this particular space. So I would say stay tuned. Okay, so another big question here, Will, is the political headlines around clean energy sound bleak? And I think that's a reference to all the efforts to roll back, like, all the clean energy tax credits and the tax on offshore wind and so on and so forth that we're seeing the current administration doing. But nonetheless, clean energy is still growing and expanding, and I'll just say that's absolutely true globally in particular. How do we communicate that state of clean energy through this challenging time? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think the headlines, the bleak headlines, convolutedly work in our favor. And I go back to that slide around the expected cost impacts of bans or restrictions. Something that we've seen very consistently historically is what we call the principle that limiting is losing. If you're the one who's taking things away and saying no and constraining, particularly in America, where we're always moving west and expanding, and the abundance, the freedom is such an important value. A lot of historically, it's often been the climate or the environmental frame that is the one that feels like limiting. You can't build there, you can't do that. We need an emissions cap on that. It is a lot of constraints, and it can sometimes be hard to sell those. We are now in the situation where I think it's very credible and easy to frame a lot of the anti-clean actions as bans and constraints on the very real progress that we were making. And you can see from that slide I shared earlier that people really expect there would be negative cost impacts or associate negative cost impacts with those kinds of constraining action.
Yeah, and then to add another angle to that is recognizing the power of norms, social norms, and that many people do not actually understand what has been happening with clean energy. And I think your data shows this as well, is that, there's still many Americans who don't yet understand that, in fact, clean electricity is cheaper now than fossils. And that's certainly true around the world as well. That is still a misperception that was true 20 years ago, but is no longer true today. And so most people are still operating with old, outdated understanding of the cost differential between these two different energy sources, broadly speaking. And yet we know that people are very affected by trends. Okay, and this is very much true in social norms. It's also true in this as well, is that they don't understand that the cost of these different technologies, of these different energy sources, has dramatically decreased. And I think probably most people on this call are very aware of that. But don't get stuck in your own loop of thinking everybody else knows what you know. They don't know what you know. And yet we have this incredible real world outcomes that are now, this is why the vast majority of investments in new power generation around the world today are going to clean sources, right? Not to fossils. In fact, it's gotten so cheap that there are utilities closing down existing running operational coal-fired power plants that they already invested $1 billion in, because it's now cheaper to close them and replace them with, say, with solar energy. That's a radically different world, and most people don't yet know that fundamental story. And so I would just say that for those that are trying to promote a more rapid transition to clean energy, talking about the fact that we are already well on the way to transitioning is a crucial, crucial story that many, many Americans have not yet heard. Okay, let's see here. We got lots of questions here, which is great. Here's another one. Are there public health angles to this communications strategy, Will?
Yeah, so there's two ways to think about that. I think one is to continue in the vein of a cost topic. We've seen people try messages that essentially equate the consequences of climate or the consequences of pollution to greater health impacts, which in turn translate to greater healthcare costs, or trying to make that a cost issue. So far, with the messages we've tested, that's a little bit much napkin math for people to get there, to couple links in the chain to kind of associate how one thing over here would lead to something over here would lead to something over here. It's a little bit big picture. But if you take the cost conversation out of it and you just focus on the health impacts of climate, and in particular, if you just focus on the health impact, and I would add the kind of nature impact of pollution, we very consistently see that pollution is a really popular villain, even more so in some cases than climate change itself. And there's a really, I think, a very rich territory that we're actually exploring more and testing right now around how to use that to open conversations with people who are concerned about petroleum-based food dyes, who are cooking those for those newly petroleum-free foods on petroleum-based stoves. So there's some opportunity to have those conversations that I think is really promising.
Yeah, and I would be remiss if I didn't channel my dear friend and colleague Ed Maybach's longstanding work, because we've been looking at how Americans conceptualize the links between climate change and health for almost 20 years now. And what we generally have found, and it's gotten better over the years, but it's still nowhere where it could be, is that most Americans don't immediately associate health impacts with climate change. There's enormous amount of good work to be done here, because in fact, the health consequences are already immense in terms of actually people dying from climate change itself, or from the burning of fossil fuels, which at least some estimates suggest might be as many as 8 million people a year around the world dying from the pollution generated by fossil fuels. And yet most people don't yet recognize that. But when we ask people how harmful are various energy sources, coming back to what today's topic, we find that people overwhelmingly already believe that coal is harmful to people's health. They already currently believe that nuclear is harmful to people's health. Now, there's a lot of debate, is nuclear truly clean or not? I'm just saying, here's what Americans actually think. It's often the second, they see it as the second most harmful to people's health. Gas, oil, all score as very dirty or very harmful. By contrast, the vast majority of people think that clean energy is clean. Okay, and I think Will just mentioned one of the power words here, and that's the word pollution, that we don't use enough. And likewise, the word clean is really important, because that's already positioning it what it is. It's far, far cleaner for the air, for the water, for the land, and for people's lungs. Like literally, we are all filters passing fossil fuel pollution through our lungs, being filtered by your lungs into your body when we are having to breathe the exhaust from these different energy sources. I don't have to do that when I breathe the energy or breathe around a wind turbine or a solar panel. So anyway, I think there's tremendous resources here in terms of helping people connect those dots to that. And the last point I'll say is there's also, again, real world evidence. Those of you who may remember that in California, there was a major oil company sponsored attempt to overturn California's global warming law a few years ago. And millions of dollars were spent on both sides of that campaign. And ultimately, the the campaign failed. The oil companies lost that handily. But the number one most effective message that the proponents of California's global warming law found was actually messages featuring the local chapter of the American Lung Association talking about all the negative health consequences of fossil fuels. So again, just underscoring that the health dimensions is yet another way that this becomes very tangible and real for people, and actually shows up in their bills as well, because of course healthcare is not free, and it can devastate people's lives. Okay, so we are nearing an end here. Let's see. How about this question, Will? What kinds of messaging are you seeing leading companies using these days? Are any leaning into talking about climate action?
They're definitely not leaning in. We've seen some data that would suggest that for the most part, companies are maintaining, if not increasing, their clean energy action and their action on climate more generally, but they are definitely talking about it less. The number of mentions in kind of externally facing investor reports and things like that has dropped drastically. But for a number of years now, like since 2023, I think we've actually been advocating for companies to start making some shifts in how they talk about this that are very much in line with this sort of affordability approach, where they're talking about, and I think this is particularly true, I would say, for companies from whom consumers have a certain set of expectations and a certain level of trust and a certain level of comfort with certain messages versus other messages. We've really been advocating what we've been calling the shift from morality to materiality, and making clean and climate a conversation about risk and opportunity, and much more about reacting to a changing world as opposed to a moral crusade to make the world in a certain way. And that shift, I think companies have gone through with to a certain extent. We've seen actually the term responsible business, which is one that we've been advocating get adopted in a number of cases. And you see companies maybe being more selective and more subtle about how they talk about this stuff. But in the places that they do, the way that they defend it and the way that they do so with confidence is actually to make basically a business case, a material case, and in some cases, sort of this affordability related, risk related, resilience related approach.
Great. Okay, so
There's
perhaps one
one.
more. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, the one I really wanted to get to, I don't know, just seeing a couple of questions. I saw one live where people had asked, is the recommendation here to not talk about climate and to talk about cost instead? And I know there's a broader question around, is climate a winner these days, that I think might be important to touch on. So as part of this test, we did a couple things. We tested movement in support of clean energy policy, movement in support of climate action, and confidence in a government official who said X. And we had a whole slew of affordability messages, and we had a climate message, our version of a climate message, which is very climate consequence focused, very extreme weather focused. Um, they, if anything, they all moved very similarly. If anything, the climate message actually moved people more on support for clean energy and climate action. And they all scored very similar in terms of what people said their confidence in a leader would be. It was at around 2/3, 64 to 67% saying I would be confident in a leader who said this for all of the messages, including the climate message. So there is not a ton of data that we've seen that suggests we need to move away from affordability if your metric is make people care about climate. It is possible to do so, and one of the best ways to do so is to talk about it. We don't ask, and as I said, we are a C3 organization. We do not ask electability questions. We are not gauging what will get you elected or what will get you votes. So that's kind of a separate question, and it's not one that I'm here to comment on. But from our data, there isn't a ton of reason to say we have to talk only about affordability or even about affordability instead of climate. Part of the reason for doing the work is that it seems inarguable right now that there are places where this conversation is necessary. We have to find a way to talk about costs, and we want to make sure we're doing it the right way. And I also, when I use the language of branding in this group about what I mean, if it will be to our benefit over the long term, if we can, whenever we bring up clean energy in any context, weave in a nod to these attributes, to these characteristics, so that we are cumulatively, collectively over time building an even stronger, and I would say even stronger because it's already stronger than I think we maybe think it is, stronger brand around clean and affordability, such that these trade-off conversations get easier over time and we experience less pushback and we find ourselves in fewer battles over the the quote unquote cost of clean energy. So not my recommendation here to supplant or move away from climate or climate consequences in particular, but very much acknowledging the importance of cost of living and affordability as a topic right now.
Yeah. So with that, thank you so much, Will. This has been a fabulous introduction to some of the current research. It's exceptionally timely given what just happened a couple days ago. We were talking before that, like we were seeing dozens of newspaper articles or news articles all talking about cost of living right now. So very, very timely. So thank you all for coming. Yes, go ahead, Will.
Yeah, real quick, because I saw a couple questions in the chat about some of the numbers I referenced off script as we went through. We have a full 30 or 40-page report coming in the next week or so that's going to be published on this. And if you're interested in receiving it, we have a QR code here on the screen to sign up for our newsletter. We're going to do a blog post on this topic very shortly, and we're going to have a fuller report linked in that blog post, which has a lot of the data that I referenced in the presentation and some other data as well.
Back to you, Eric.
Thank you, Dr. Leiserowitz and Will Howard, for your insights. We will send everyone a follow-up email after this event with the recording and information on the next event of our fall speaker series. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a great rest of your week. Take care.